What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 4040 Vision podcast. I'm your host, Khaled Abdallah. I've got a special guest with me today, Doug McCray of the Big Douglas Show. How's it going today, Doug?
It's going
Yeah,
good,
thanks
man.
for
Thanks for
agreeing
having
to
me on
join.
today.
So, today's episode is going to be about the Daniel Snyder era of the Washington football team, Washington Commanders, Washington Redskins, whatever you want to call them. So, let's start off with some of your background when it comes to this team. So, how long have you been a fan of this team, and why did you become a fan of this team?
Well, I'll age myself here. I guess I've been a fan since the early 90s. My dad was in the military, so we moved a bunch. I actually grew up on basketball more than football. But that Doug Williams Super Bowl against the Broncos really was like the first time, I guess, where I was allowed to stay up and watch the whole thing. And so it's just always resonated. And then my dad ended up retiring, and we our last stop of duty there was in just outside of DC. So it just was like a natural thing where me and my brother started following the team, and really it was something that we bonded over, which is why I think it
So you
stuck so
mentioned the
long.
Doug Williams team, the Super Bowl team. That's when they beat the Broncos, of course. So did you have a favorite player from that era or favorite players from that era? Because that was a pretty legendary time for the team.
It feels like the quarterbacks always get the love. I don't think they got the same kind of love back then than they do now. For those Redskins teams, it was more about the Hogs, really, and Joe Gibbs, of course, with the coach, because each of those Super Bowls with different quarterbacks. So we didn't in Washington. We didn't lean on the quarterbacks much as we did that offensive line and Coach Gibbs and maybe some of the
Yeah, it's
receivers.
not often that an offensive line group gets as cool of a nickname as this, or any nickname at all. So that's awesome. As a
Yeah,
former very mediocre high school offensive lineman, it was cool that these guys got that kind of recognition. So this I think I'd say the glory days of the Washington team was during the Jack Kent Cook era, and that was for spanned about 30 years, right, until he passed away. Dan Snyder buys the team in the late 90s. Am I right? And so, what did you think of
that's
Dan
right.
Snyder as he was looking to buy the team? Did you have any opinion of him? Did you know of him when he was looking to buy the team?
No, not really. And of course, like I said, I'd have been a late teens, I guess. So but it was exciting at the time. I mean, a young guy who grew up rooting for the team becomes wealthy from a business adventure and buys his favorite hometown football team. Like in the moment, you couldn't have scripted anything better. I mean, he was not arrogant in the moment, but I think young and brash. And so you kind of had this like, they were coming off of really good years with the Super Bowls. And so I think it was like, man, if this guy just keeps his foot on the gas, what more can we get here? And it
So,
was
what would you
exciting
say
for
like
sure.
your realistic hopes were? Did you think that he was going to lead the team back to the promised land?
I mean, I thought for sure that we'd stay relevant. You know what I mean? Like I don't think in the moment that we thought that we were going to go to the Super Bowl every 4 years, but I think we thought at least he would keep it
Mhm.
going. Just success. I mean, if you're only
Yeah.
monitoring success by Super Bowls, that's a tough barometer. But I think we thought we'd be winners every year and at least go into the playoffs and not eventually become a laughing stock of the
I mean,
league.
so
So
for the most part, I think when I think of this team during this era, it's been pretty relevant, right? It's somewhat competitive. There's been, of course, some down years, some lean years. I mean, would you say that for the most part, you guys have been in the mix? I think you have two or three division titles during his reign, a couple playoff wins. What do you think? How would you grade this era out of 10?
yeah, he gets
Okay.
he gets an F, most certainly. You meant there were, I think, two division championships and one
Oh,
no
wow.
playoff wins since he's been here 20 years. No, and they've had winning records like 5, 6 times. since he took ownership of the team. So no, it was a
Okay.
terrible, terrible job by him as ownership. But one day they will teach
Mhm.
business classes on how to take such a easy business and just destroy it in ways that you
Mm.
couldn't even imagine that you could destroy a team. And he's tried it
Yeah.
every which way, none
Yeah.
of
I
it
was
worked.
trying to
So
gauge the
it was a
temperature here
debacle.
on what you thought of him, but we can deep dive
Yeah.
and be a little more critical. So I want to say the Snyder era has been marked by a lot of like a high turnover rate at coaching and at head coach. I think the longest tenured head coach was Mike Shanahan for about 5 years. I think Gruden had five and some change. Do you think that was a product of ownership?
I think it was actually
Okay, so
Gruden, but close. I think Gruden got the only extension of the group. But yeah, like I said, he tried it every which way. I mean, to me, his biggest mistake was firing Schottenheimer. That team got off slow, but they ended up winning a lot of football games at the back end. He wanted something different. They went Spurrier. That didn't work out. After Spurrier, they had their eyes. At that point, I think it was the special teams coordinator for the Giants. That fell through, so that they ended up hiring Jim Zorn, who had never been more than a wide receivers coach in the league. As you can imagine, debacle. And then Shanahan, which didn't go well because of the RG3 situation and what happened there. Gruden was okay. Gruden was I think their best chance of winning. Gruden's funny that those offenses were
yeah.
magnificent offenses that moved the ball all over the place, but the defenses were terrible. And it's just my opinion, but I think that his unwillingness to hire a defensive coordinator that could have taken his job kept him from hiring a defensive coordinator that could have matched. What happened is they were top five, top 10 in offense. They'd be bottom 25, 30 in defense. They had a chance to get Wade
Mhm.
Phillips one year, I remember. And I think he was worried that one of those senior defensive coordinators, while be it good for their record, I think he was worried he'd lose his job to them. So it was little things like that where you felt like things were getting like every time things would start moving in the right direction, something would happen. It would come to a
Yeah, I
crashing
can
halt.
totally sympathize. You can see from the hat I'm wearing, I'm a Raiders fan, and I think the parallels between the two teams since the turn of the century are pretty similar with a lot of the coaching turnover, quarterback turnover, ownership issues. Hopefully, I mean, with
Both had our own
what was
Grudens
that?
to worry with.
Yeah,
We both had our own
there
Grudens
you
to
go.
worry
That's
with.
right. Yeah, I mean, our Gruden kind of left it a little more embarrassing or humiliating fashion, but yeah, similar end where there was a couple peaks and there was some times where we probably both thought we were going to turn the corner, but things didn't go quite so well. So, I mean, of the coaches and the quarterbacks that you just mentioned RG3, but of those guys, who did you think you had the best chance of success with, the coaching or the quarterback?
Sure. Well, when Zorn left and they hired Shanahan, after Zorn, apathy was starting to set in with the fan base. And apathy is so much worse than hatred, because if you hate something, at least you care about it a little bit. When you're apathetic to something and you just don't care, like that's, you talk about the death knell for an organization or a business or a relation to anything. When apathy sets in, that's it, right? And that, you could tell that had crept in. In comes a two-time winning Super Bowl champ and coach in Mike Shanahan, and you're thinking, yeah, this is it. This is fantastic. Well, I don't know what it was with Mike, but I think they always, and again, this comes back to the ownership stuff, right? I don't think that Mike wanted to bring in an aging Donovan McNabb, even though he said yes because the owner wanted that. And they had Campbell still on staff. I think people thought maybe Campbell in the right system could have been a good quarterback. They moved on from him for McNabb. McNabb was a total bust. The next year they played Rex Grossman and John Beck. In fact, the famous quote from Shanahan is, "I'll stake my reputation on John Beck."
Didn't last
Okay,
long.
and he did, and that proved out to be right. And so it's just odd because people were very excited, and then they trade for RG3. Shanahan, I don't think was. I know Shanahan. It was not his idea. I know from talking to people in the organization that he wasn't upset about it, but it said, RG3 is a 3-year project and we'll have to do all of his college stuff for the first 2 years. It's a big long story. We could do a whole nother
Sure.
segment episode on what happened with Robert, but his dad got unprecedented power because of the owner, and it just didn't meld right. So outside of that 2012, and then you had the injury, of course, so that didn't work well. Then after Shanahan goes, and you can look at the coaching tree and know what that should have been in Washington, but
Yeah.
it didn't work. Jay Gruden was the hottest offensive coordinator in the NFL that year with the Bengals. So like felt like that's the funny thing with Shanahan, right? He or with Snyder, he's tried it every which possible way. Vet
Hmm.
coach, he brought Gibbs back. Vet coach, brand new hot coordinator. It's the problem was him in the front office. We were talking about each of us having a team that had a Jay Gruden or a Gruden. Your John Gruden got run out of town basically because Snyder and Bruce Allen leaked
It's
out the
a
emails.
nice
So
ironic
I mean,
twist
it's just
there.
like that's talk about one franchise bleeding into another one. It's been that kind of comedy of errors here
Yeah,
for
there's a
20
couple things you
years.
mentioned that I want to touch on. We also got the Jason Campbell experience. I thought he was, a solid winning quarterback in the in the right
I forgot
situation.
that.
Of course, his
Mhm.
career ends with Washington prematurely, and then with Oakland as well because he breaks his collarbone and he has to. The Raiders bring in Carson Palmer, and then he kind of becomes a journeyman after that. And then you talked about RG3 with the Mike Shanahan era. One thing you didn't mention was I think they drafted Kirk Cousins the same year they drafted Robert Griffin. Yeah. So, what did
They
you
did.
think of that decision? Was that
Yes.
a kind of them hedging, saying, okay, well, Shanahan, maybe you didn't want RG3, you didn't want to give up all this for a more project type quarterback, even though he played well his rookie year. Was that a concession to Mike Shanahan? And do you think that was some of the organizational dysfunction shining through and drafting two quarterbacks pretty high?
Yeah, I mean, Cousins in the fourth, I think, was a little bit of a surprise. And I think it probably was a bit of a concession to your point. But they had nobody. They really didn't have anything. The quarterback room was bare, and I think Shanahan was one of those guys that felt like, listen, I'll draft if everything goes right with Robert, and he becomes a franchise type quarterback, and I have Cousins who probably just needs a little bit of polishing on the sideline, and we can get him up to speed in a more traditional offense. Then if things go two things, if things go miserably wrong with Robert, then you have Cousins who fits the bill a little bit better. Two, and this is what Belichick did for a couple of years, right? Was I'll draft that guy, we'll work on him, we'll do the hard work, and then I'll ship him off for another third round pick in 2 years. It's like it's saving assets. And I really think that was more of what Kirk Cousins was investment in future assets rather than this notion that we'll get this guy just in case Robert sticks. I think it was more the other than it was they're
Sure.
thinking that Robert wouldn't make it.
Hmm.
Because one, winners don't think that way. Right. Like I mean, I think that more than anything is you don't go into a project thinking it's gonna fail. So I think that was the
That makes
thinking
sense. I mean,
behind
it's
that.
also like a low cost backup quarterback option because you get a guy in the fourth round, he costs pennies compared to maybe a veteran quarterback. And
Sure.
just like you said with Belichick, they develop a guy from the fourth, fifth, sixth round like Jimmy G or Ryan Mallett, and they ship him off for a decent draft pick, and they
Mhm.
able to do that.
Jacoby Brissett, who's
Yeah, there you
on
go.
the
There you go.
Commanders now.
So during that RG3, the rookie year, where it seemed like he might have some franchise quarterback potential, and then of course the injury happens, I believe, at the end of the season, and then it compounds in the playoffs. What did you think of that decision to play him on his injured knee, and how do you think that affected the team for the next few years after that?
Well, when the 30 for 30 comes out with Shanahan and Robert, I think it will be fascinating to watch because I'm not sure people outside of the fan base really kind of understand what was going on there. So you that season, you got to go back like a month before the season ends when Robert gets hit by I think it was Haloti Ngata at that point with the Ravens. It was one of those humongous guys, and the leg goes all looks it just looks terrible. And here's what happens. They tell him nothing structurally has happened, but he needs to sit and wait. Well, the next game against the Browns, Kirk Cousins comes out and I think goes for like 300 yards, 3 touchdowns, and interceptions, something like that. And it was like kind of my eye opening, you know. And I think Robert saw it and was like, "Oh man, I got to get ready now." And so I think he was pushing to get back on as much as Shanahan was trying to get him back out there. And that's, I think, all of us that watch sports in general, much less football, realize there's a couple of distinctions that you have to make. One, there's a difference between being hurt and being injured. There's a difference between a player rushing back to get on the field. That's kind of a coach's job, is to manage. Are you telling me the truth right now about your injury? Because the doc can only say, all the doc can do is tell you whether it's still intact or not. And at that point, it was intact. Now, you fast forward to that playoff game against Seattle, and Robert was fantastic in the first quarter. In fact, I remember thinking we were boat racing them at halftime. And I was stunned that they brought Robert back after the half. I thought they had that win locked up, and that would have been that. Well, they didn't. Robert's knee gets messed up worse. Part of that is the field was in terrible condition. I think that's been well documented. The painted grass and whatnot. But the problem is after that, as the story goes, and it's been confirmed by other players, so I feel confident in saying I believe the story to be true. Robert and his dad walk in to Shanahan's office with Kyle and a couple other guys, and they go up to the whiteboard and they start writing plays that, like, we're not doing this anymore. None of this works. He thought he was Aaron Rodgers already and was ready to run that Shanahan West Coast offense and didn't want to run any of the Baylor stuff. That Kyle had gone down there and met with Browse. They had, he studied that offense for Robert. Robert said he wasn't going to do it anymore. The other problem is that Adidas comes out a month before the next season starts, and they do the all in for week one
Oh
campaign.
wow.
And it really put Robert in a tough spot where he shouldn't have started that game. He needed another month, I bet. But between him and his dad thinking that he really was Superman, and this Adidas campaign, and probably Kirk Cousins waiting in the background, it just was doomed from the beginning. And it's sad because
Yeah,
it
I
didn't
mean,
have
this
to be.
is incredible insight that, again, like you said, only people in the fan base, someone like you, would know, because from the outside looking in, it looked like, okay, he got hurt at the end of the season. He looked okay. I think the last game of the season, you guys beat the Cowboys in the win and you're in scenario, which was a,
That's right.
yeah, pretty
Yep.
colossal
New Year's.
collapse from the Cowboys. I think were running away with it at some point. And then there's that image that I'll never forget in my mind of RG3 with this gigantic leg brace on this awful torn up field, like you said, that painted
Yeah.
grass. I know the grass doesn't do well in the Northeast in the winter time, and he's diving for a loose ball, and his leg just goes in a direction that it's not supposed to go, and it felt like after that his career was just never the same. And it's amazing insight that you provide, where it's like it wasn't really that simple. There was a lot more kind of backroom politics where, like you said, Kirk Cousins is waiting in the wings to take over the job, so there's probably additional pressure. RG3 is facing even more pressure because he's, the top. Was he number 2 pick that year, I believe? So he's thinking,
They traded 3 picks to get up
yeah. So
there
there's
to number
all
two
this
to take him.
pressure.
That was the Andrew Luck year. And Luck goes
Mhm.
one, Robert
Yeah,
goes
and
two.
and to me, I think if there is a more competent owner, someone that has a little more foresight, they're able to step in and kind of put a kibosh on the situation and say, you know what, you're going to sit until you're fully healthy, and we're not going to let this young kid call the shots. I mean, am I way off base with that assessment?
No, that's it. He
Mm.
and the owner were buddies. And just as much as it was RG3 and the owner, it
Mm.
was RG2 because the dad was in the locker room
It's
all the
never a good
time.
thing.
I mean, after
These sports
games.
parents get too involved.
It never happens. It never happens at the pro level, ever. And that's what it was. I mean, the owner would frequently get enamored with the players and give them stuff and give them access that generally doesn't happen unless you're Tom Brady or something like that. And it just happened really fast. It was a mistake. And yeah, I mean, it wasn't just the bad things that happened here, because if it was, then, Robert would have caught on somewhere
Yeah,
else
I
and he
think
just
once
didn't.
his knee was, he blew out his knee or had that injury. I think after that he just wasn't the same player, and we saw that he had a journeyman career after that. He had some bright moments, I think, with Cleveland and Baltimore, but yeah,
But
no,
and quickly, not to cut you off, but just so we're not like steady bashing Robert, because that's I don't want to do that either. The other thing with Robert that people I don't think get is he wasn't a Lamar Jackson type runner. He was an Olympic sprinter. Like if you think about that play where against the Vikings, where he's just like chucking it down the side, like that's what he does. He gets from 0 to 60 real fast. But as you can see, the knees weren't built for change of direction. Like that, just like he exploded his own knees on some of those plays trying to get left and right. And so I think that's the other thing is like people look at Robert and think Michael Vick and Lamar Jackson, two completely different types of
yeah,
speed
he
in running.
reminded me a little bit of like the Colin Kaepernick, that big, tall, long strider that's not not going to
Long
shake you
strider,
in
true.
the box, but he'll once he hits the corner, he might beat you to the corner and run 60 yards downfield. So I get what you're saying, and yeah, I mean it's unfortunate because obviously he's a very competitive dude, and some of the thinking behind what he was doing was trying to prove that he belonged and all that. So yeah, again, like you said, we don't want to just bash him the whole time. So you know when do you think so what point in the Dan Snyder era did public opinion start turning on him? Because there's been a number of high profile things. There's like the medical issues with Alex Smith's leg, Trent Williams with the growth on his head, some of the workplace like impropriety, sexual harassment stuff. When did public opinion locally start to shift on Dan Snyder?
Well, I think it hit. I mean, the losing creates animosity, right? So I think there had been maybe 10 years in, like maybe after some of the Albert Hainsworth stuff, where it was like things just, if you can't get it working with a Shanahan type coach, it makes you feel like when
So
can you
when
get it
we're talking
working?
about
So I
Albert
think
Hainsworth,
some
sorry,
of it
was
crept
that
in
giving him
there,
that
but
massive contract? Mm-hmm.
right, and then it just
Sure.
totally falling apart. Within that thing fell apart quickly. Turns out Fat Albert's just not a very nice man, and so that, I mean that was as much as anything else. However, so I think that was part of it. I think when Gibbs 2.0 fell apart, people started wondering if you can't get it done with Gibbs, how do you get it done? And then I think the biggest one though was with the cheerleader scandal, and the voice of the Redskins at the time, Michaels, was removed, and kind of Bruce Allen finally got his walking papers, and they got through it. McLuhan was there, and then they went through was he a drinker or not a drinker? I mean, literally the last 20 years with Washington, if you could just like close your eyes and throw a dart at a scandal board, you know what I mean? Like that's how it felt. And I think that was it. Like with that cheerleader scandal came out, and it was starting to be like, well, it's not just a crappy product on the field. It's like this guy really is into some shady type stuff behind the scenes and up in the, and it was like everybody had to call him Mr. Like things just started coming out. The Post had kind of put out stories over the years. It was like, okay, right, whatever. But then once you started getting some of the, like you had to call him Mr. Snyder, and he was telling, ladies that maybe it's their fault that they're dressing too skimpily, at the office or whatever it was just like once that stuff started coming out, where it's like, man, this guy's kind of just a creepo, that I think things really started. There was a bigger uproar about, man, I hope we can get
Yeah,
something
it goes
changed.
from maybe you chalk it up to like incompetence, like oh maybe he's just not very good at his job, and then it becomes like you said, it goes from just an bad off the field on the field product to some real concerns off the field with his behavior and his attitude, and of course all the things that he let happen under his watch. I mean, and then the medical stuff, was that also organizational, or do you think that was just kind of a freak accident? Where, I mean, I know it happened twice with Alex Smith and Trent Williams, but was that him being too cheap on the medical side of things and making bad decisions, or was it just, coincidence?
Well, he was definitely cheap. I know that. And I've been told by players that they didn't even really revamp the medical facilities and the training facilities until Robert got hurt. Like I remember Clinton Porter saying that it was not until Robert got hurt. Like when he was there, they were sharing one cold tub. And so I think there's some of that stuff that he just was cheap about that probably didn't help. The stuff with Trent, the stuff with both of them is odd. Like Trent should have been given everything in the world so that he was a Redskin for life. If you listen to them, they really thought that they were there. Like Dan was flying him in the private jet to his medical appointments, and supposedly Dan did go see him. Trent said nobody went to go see him, and so like they're tricky, right? Because I don't want to tell Trent what happened
Yeah,
with
of
his
course.
cancer scare. If you got cancer on your forehead and the doc says this isn't good, I'm sure
Hmm.
you're freaking out. Like I've had a couple of
Yeah, sure.
medical scares myself, so I totally get it. I don't of all the many things, I don't think those two things were on Dan.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. Maybe just a little bit of.
Like with Alex, that was a freak thing, right? Like that, the leg just got snapped so terribly. Like those infections didn't happen, you know, at like
Mhm.
Redskins Park or anything. Like that was it. The major medical facility in town where I think that was on them, and then they had to go in and clean it out. So I don't know that the lot, it's hard to get a lot of the information on the medical stuff. Dan wears a lot of the weight of this organization. I'm not
Sure,
sure
sure.
those
Yeah,
two
I
things
think
are on
maybe
him.
just it's easy to pile on at that point because there's so many other things that you can blame him for. Like you said, wears the weight of it. How did you feel that he handled the name controversy and the fact that people were pushing for the change from Redskins to something a little more generic, and then now to the Commanders? Do you think that was also something he did wrong? Do you think he handled that well? What do you think?
I actually think he handled that one fairly well. Again, that's his favorite team. He's on record saying he was never going to change the name, but once people hated him and businesses, when FedEx and Pepsi and Coke and your major sponsors say they're going to pull naming rights and they're not going to, that's a lot of money. And so it was not, people often confuse Dan with a guy who didn't love the team. Like people will say, he made it the Commanders on his way out as a big, middle finger to the organization. And it's not that. I've talked to people inside the building, and like Dan still loves the organization and the team the same way the day he bought it. He just wasn't good at it. That was his problem. He just stunk at his job. I mean, imagine how terrible it must feel to buy your favorite football team. Imagine buying the Raiders and then get booed because you've done such a terrible job. Like, how horrible of a feeling is that? And essentially, that's what happened with Dan, is that he was so bad at loving his favorite football team
Hmm.
that they ran him out. But so that's what I'm saying. Like the Redskins, that was not his choice by any means. He did not want to do that. He just had no choice. And we can argue all day, and they still do in the fan base, about whether Redskins is offensive, whether Native Americans actually care about it, how many Native Americans have to be put off by the name Redskins to change it.
Hmm.
Is it one? Is it 1,000? Is it 50%? Like that's, trust me, they've done all the research on it. I preferred football team. They could have stuck with Washington football team. Quite frankly, the Commanders
Yeah.
is just as fine. It's just as bad. It doesn't. It doesn't matter if they start winning football games,
Yeah,
people will be
exactly. I
fine with
mean, again,
Commanders.
as an outsider, I liked Washington football team more. Maybe it's the soccer fan in me. I thought it was cool, unique. Commanders is it's okay. It feels a little generic, but Washington
Yeah,
football team that's cool. That's unique. So, and again, this is great insight because again, as an outsider, I'm looking at it as this guy doesn't care because I'm going through that situation now as an Oakland A's fan where we have an owner where you can just tell he just doesn't care about the product on or off the field. So he's not invested his
yep,
time, his money, and it seems like with Dan, they care or he cared, which again I didn't know. I thought it was just incompetence. He's cheap, he's cutting corners, doesn't want to build a new stadium. But they're also investing in some key players, and I think throughout his era, you guys have had some pretty legendary players that have come through the building, and of course some have left in tragic fashion with Sean Taylor. So during this time, I mean, what do you think was the biggest factor in his failure to succeed? Because obviously he cared and he spent money. I know they spent a lot of money on free agents and things like that. Why couldn't he get this team over the hump and be a regular, successful contender?
yeah, and that's why I said I think it will make for a great, business school. One of the great Carnegie Mellon type institutions where they focus in business because it seemingly is impossible. The NFL is built for parity. I mean, I didn't just make that up. Like everybody knows that they'll tell you, right? Like that's supposed to be the whole point is that you're supposed to be down, even if you're down for a couple of years, you should be able to get back to at least average fairly soon. And I think I, the only thing that you can come up with is that, as the old adage gets, you get what you give out. And I just, if you don't believe in karma, then look at the Commanders and Dan Snyder because I don't think what else could it be? Because he tried it every single way. Pay for big free agents, don't pay for big free agents. Trade up in the draft, stay where you're at. Hire a Super Bowl winning head coach. Hire the fresh offensive coordinator. Do it with a GM. Do it. I mean, literally every way that you can imagine, he's tried it and it didn't work. And that to me just means it's him.
Yeah, and
It's
I
got to be
think
him.
another adage in sports is that you can't outrun bad ownership. You can have a small period of success here and there. We look at
Yeah.
some across the different organizations. As a Raiders fan, I see it. The Warriors before this current ownership group, same thing. The Suns, they had this brief period. They had one of the worst owners in sports, and Robert Sarver, and it's just unfortunate that with some guys you're just not going to see success or at least sustained success because like you said in the NFL it's built for parity. You're going to have top draft picks and you might fall here and there like ass backwards into an all pro player and you'll have some success, but unless you have great ownership and stable ownership and someone with like a clear vision that knows how to implement it, you're just not going to be able to find that sustained success. So I think we've talked enough about the past. Let's talk about the future. And speaking of a sustained vision and sustained success, you guys have a new ownership group led by Josh Harris, who currently owns the New Jersey Devils, who are a playoff team, the 76ers, who are perennial playoff team now after the process. So, what are some of your expectations and feelings? Are you a little, are you holding off on your expectations? Are you trying to maintain them because of the past? Like you've been hurt before, so you don't want to get too excited.
Yes. We have been beaten down as a Washington fan base. So yeah, I think it's in our nature now to be a little skittish and show me and then I'll believe you type scenario. But I mean, he's never run an NFL organization, so I mean it's hard to know or expect anything. But he's got experience, as you've said, owning franchises like major sports franchises. And what he's done with I don't know enough about the hockey side. I don't know what he's done with the Devils to really speak on that. But with the 76ers, I mean, they totally redesigned the way the system worked there, and it's been successful. And he's proven that he'll do what it takes to continue moving. They did that this year by firing Doc Rivers, right after being to the playoffs. I think all the years Doc was there. So I like that as far as, like average is not good enough. We've been average in Washington for a while. Ron Rivera, God bless him, and all the stuff he's had to go through since he's been here, but they fought their butts off to be average. And that's in the end of that's not what we're looking for, right? So, I mean, I'm excited. I'm holding off judgment. There's a lot of things he can do quickly to, we said earlier, just kind of spruce up the facilities and make it nicer for the players to be there. That they haven't had that kind of overhaul. Looks like they're going to spend a bunch of money on the stadium trying to upgrade the sound and some of the boards and stuff. So, I mean, he can come in and do some of that stuff right away and make the experience a little bit better for everybody, fans
Yeah,
and
he's
players.
definitely not scared to make changes that need to be made, and he's not going to be gun shy about it. Are you worried about a possible process type situation where he might take the long vision and tank for a couple years to rebuild the team? What do you think their approach is going to be in the next few years?
It'll be interesting. I think the current analytics staff for Washington is like 6 people. Like, I mean, it's ridiculously tiny. We know that Josh Harris will change that because he's proven to be an analytics guy. I don't know why you'd be like that. That's a philosophical thing, right? You don't do it just because it's been proven to work. It's how your brain works and understands how things are successful. So I doubt he'd do one thing in basketball and not that in football. I say this all the time on my podcast, like be careful what you ask for, right? Because the team's been 8-1 kind of team for a while now, and just right on the door of the playoffs. We actually haven't done like a 3-win team in 4 or 5 years, and even before that, we weren't doing a ton of like 3-win teams. So it's easy to say let's start over, and then you start over, and it's like this is awful. So, do they need? I don't think they need it. Quite frankly, it'll be curious to see how Howell does this year. If Howell stinks and the team's no good, then they've got a real shot at getting one of these quarterbacks in the draft. But just from a pure roster standpoint, Ron probably doesn't get enough credit for how good the roster is now compared to when he got here. The problem is he's tried every way that he can. Like we talked about, all the way Dan's tried to win. Ron's tried all those ways to get a quarterback, and he just hadn't been able to get it done. And that's been his problem. And it's the problem for any coach in the league that doesn't have a top 15, 10-ish type
It's
quarterback.
the same
So
thing. You can't outrun bad ownership for long. You can have a good season here or there. Same thing with quarterback play. You can kind of patch together a competitive team like you guys have done in the past few years with some journeyman quarterbacks, some veteran quarterbacks. You're just kind of gambling and trying new things, just putting someone new back there and seeing what happens. So I think, I mean, from like you said, from a roster perspective, I think you guys have the makings of a competitive team with obviously just missing that key piece at quarterback. And I mean, Howell looked good at the end of last season. That was a very small sample size against the Cowboys team. I think that didn't need to win at that point. But there's some.
but they had all this
Mhm.
just for context. They did have all. You're right about the Cowboys, but oddly enough, they
Yeah,
played
I
the
think they had
starters
like
the
an
whole game that
outside
day.
chance if the Eagles lost to the Giants, but it wasn't like a very a real. It wasn't a very
Yeah.
realistic scenario. But still, I mean, I liked what I saw from him. Obviously, the team does because you guys didn't make a move for a quarterback in the draft. So I think you guys are in a great position because, like you said, if he doesn't work out, then you're in position to draft Caleb Williams, Drake May, or one of these other kids that are coming up, and then you can build for the future. And of course, if he works out, then you have a defense, you have a roster continuity, you have head coach continuity, coordinator continuity, which I think is obviously a very big factor in the success of the team. So I mean, any final thoughts on the Dan Snyder era? Any parting shots you want to take? I know you have your show that comes on every a few times a week, but anything else you want to share with our listeners about the last 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the end, I'll feel. It's funny. We were talking about this the other day. When we found out that there was a chance, never. There's never a chance that an owner is going to sell, right? Because literally, you've got to do what Dan did. You have to like be drugged before congressional hearings and stuff before they'll actually kick you out. And I really think that you know they went to the game one time, him and his wife Tanya, and they booed Tanya when she got up when they put her picture up on the big screen. And I really think that those were some of the moments where it was like, this is not, the juice is not worth the squeeze, as they say, and this is no longer fun. It should be fun to own your favorite football team. So while I will always be mad at Dan for ruining my favorite football team for 20 years of my life, I also feel bad for Dan in some ways that he got what almost all of us dream of. I mean, again, imagine tomorrow them saying, "Here, Khaled, here's the Raiders. You own them. Have fun." And it becoming so bad that you get booed and don't want the team anymore. So I have a love hate relationship with Dan. He turned out to be a terrible, horrible, slimy person, and yet there's a piece of me that is empathetic about how terrible the whole thing must have been for him. So
Yeah, it's
hasta la vista, Dan, as they say. You know, have fun in England or wherever he takes his mega yacht to, and lives the rest of his life with his $4.5 billion. And you
yeah. I
know
was
he's
gonna
feeling
say
bad for
that
Dan, right? He bought the team for less than a
that
billion.
price tag, that windfall. I
He
mean,
made.
it's
I mean, by the time he's said and done with everything, he probably put $2 billion in his pocket after taxes and paying off the loan at the end and everything. So I'm excited for the future, man. That's where I'm at now. Things are changing. The team has a chance to be good. We'll see. You know, they'll have big decisions to make once ownership's finalized with the upper management and coaching staff and all those things. But you know, I think whether Ron's here, that's
mhm.
like a different show. But he will have definitely left it better than he found it, and that's not. We will not be
Yeah,
saying the same
absolutely. And
for
I think,
Dan.
like I said, you guys are in a great position. You're in a there's it's a fresh start. You don't have that albatross of the reputation of Dan Snyder, that Dan Snyder name around your neck. There's going to be, I think, a lightness in the air. Maybe if you go to a game week one or whenever the home opener is, I think it's going to be a different vibe around the stadium and a hopefulness for the future. And there's so many things that are in your favor: the media market, the location, the prestige of the franchise, which I think will be restored in time. And again, as a Raiders fan, I can definitely sympathize with everything you've gone through. And there's hope for the future. And in your case, you don't even have to move in order to have this fresh start. So,
That's right.
thanks again for your time today, Doug. I really appreciate it. We'll definitely make sure to have you on. Maybe at the end of the season, we can do a season recap and see how things have gone in the first year of the Josh Harris era.
Yeah, that'd be great.